Sawete Discipuli. We're going to be working through the translation of the Great Flood story together. Please have the copy of the story in front of you, as well as the vocabulary list. What I will be doing is talking about the grammatical construction of the sentence, which will help you to understand how to put all of the words together. Special focus and emphasis needs to be given attention to when we are talking about the passive voice as well as about the relative clauses. When we are finished looking at a sentence or two smaller sentences, then you will be given the opportunity to write down your translation for those sentences in a question that follows the instructional portion of the video. Let's get started with our first sentence. Jupiter rex deorum de Olympo genus hominum spectavit, et videt dolores et injurias, quae in terras a Pandora mittebantur. I definitely saw at least 3 verbs in this entire sentence. Spectavit, videt, and mittebantur. Remember that in a Latin sentence, when we have multiple verbs, we also have multiple clauses or units of thought. And so what we need to do when we find multiple verbs is to determine where each of those units of thought begins and ends. I began by putting a bracket at the beginning of the sentence and at the end of the sentence, because that's the logical place where a clause begins and a clause ends. But where do the clauses end between the beginning and the end? Remember that the verb can often serve as the end of a clause, especially if followed by a conjunction. So as soon as I see spectavit, I see the word et after it. This helps me to understand that spectavit is the end of the first unit of thought. Videt has to begin the second unit of thought. And although I don't see a verb at the end of it because it begins with a verb, what I do see as I keep going in the sentence is the relative pronoun quae. That must always begin its own unit of thought or its own clause. And therefore, I know that after videt, the unit of thought or the clause ends at injurias. Now I'm going to focus on each individual clause and think about the items that are within it. When I go back and reread the first clause, Jupiter rex deorum de Olympo genus hominum spectavit, I notice the prepositional phrase de Olympo. I want to put that in parentheses because it helps me to understand that those two words must stay together. I also noticed, did you, that Jupiter is in the nominative form, as well as rex. Both of them are nominative case nouns. Usually when you have two nominative case nouns close like this, and there is no conjunction between them, the second one is telling you something about the first one in English. We call it an appositive, a noun that renames or defines another noun. So this is the subject of my clause, Jupiter the king, and then I notice that right after that I have the word aurum, which is the Latin word deus dei, or God. The aurum is genitive plural. So when I translate the word gods into English, I'm going to put the word of in front of it. So I have Jupiter, king of the gods. Now, if that's my subject, I would normally look for my verb next, which I've already found, spectavit. Do you notice that it has this AV in the base of the word? That AV is from the third principal part of the verb specto, spectare, spectavi, spectatum. That means that it has to be written in either the perfect, the pluperfect, or the future perfect tense. The IT tells me that this verb is in the perfect tense. So when I translate it, I'll simply translate it in the past tense as watched. Now, if I know that Jupiter is doing this action, then I know that he has to do this action to something. So that means that of the two words I have left, genus and hominum, I should be able to find something in the accusative case. Hominum certainly looks accusative with that um on it, but when I look at the verb homo hominis on the vocabulary list, I see that it is from third declension, and the accusative ending for third declension is em. When you have um on a third declension noun, it's in the genitive plural. The only thing that's left is genus, but genus is in the nominative form. I mean, after all, it ends with us, and it is the first noun on the vocabulary list. But let's look at that entry on the vocabulary list. Do you notice that it is in the neuter? That means that genus's nominative form is also its accusative form. So this is my direct object for that first idea. Now I'm going to take a closer look at the second clause, which is joined to the first one by the word and. So as soon as you're finished putting together the meaning of all of the words in the first clause, you will add the word and then the translation of your second clause. It begins with the verb widet, which is from wideo, widera, widi, wisum. Wideo, widera is a second conjugation verb. I know this because of the EO in the first principal part and the ERE on the second principal part. If this verb were in the present tense, I would see the connecting vowel of E between the base, VID, and the ending T, but I do not. Instead, I see the letter I. That means that I am not looking at a present tense verb. Instead, I am looking at the base of the third principal part, weed, VID, and the perfect tense ending, it. This verb is in the third person singular of the perfect tense. That means it has as its pronoun subject he, she, or it. When I look at dolores and injurias, I notice right away that injurias has an accusative plural ending from first declension. I also notice that it's got the word and between it and dolores, which means that those two words must be of equal value. In Latin, that means they have the same case. So both dolores and injurias are in the accusative case, serving as direct objects of the verb weeded, with the third person singular pronoun he as its subject. Of course, it's actually referring to Jupiter. Now, let's examine the relative clause. I'm going to talk first of all about the relative pronoun quae. Remember that the relative pronoun has as its antecedent a noun which is in the same gender and number as the relative pronoun. Quae can be feminine, nominative, and singular. But I notice that I have no feminine, nominative, singular nouns in the sentence. Quae can also be feminine, nominative, and plural. I do have a plural feminine noun in my sentence, injurias. Quae can also be feminine, neuter, not feminine neuter, it can be neuter, nominative or accusative plural. When I look at my sentence, I do have a neuter noun, genus, but it is not plural, it is singular. For this reason, I know that the antecedent of quae must be injurias. Now, why is this important? Well, it's important because when I translate this sentence, the translation of quae must go immediately after injurias in my English translation. That's how I will know that that's what the relative clause is connected to. The word injurias also helps me to understand whether to pick whom or which or who as the translation. Because injurias is an inanimate object, I will pick which as the translation of quae. When I look at the verb mittebantur, I notice several things about it. First of all, it's passive. See the NTUR? That makes it passive. The ba in front of the enter tells me that it's in the imperfect tense. The enter also tells me that my subject is third person plural. So quae, or which, is my subject. Remember that it's talking about the injurias. The translation of mittebantur has to be passive. So that means that the quae, or the injurias, are not doing the act of sending, but the act of sending was being done to them. And in this relative clause, I actually know by whom. See that little word a in front of Pandora? That's the preposition ab, which means from. But in a sentence with the passive voice like we have here, especially when there is a name of a person, or in this case, a goddess or a nymph, or if it's a noun referring to a person like man or woman or king or queen, the a is translated as by. This is the by zombies phrase that we heard about in the one video, which helped us to learn how to recognize the passive voice in a sentence in English. We're going to learn who actually did the sending of the injurias in this sentence. When I see the a or ab used with the name of a person or a noun referring to a person in a sentence with a passive voice verb, I have found the by phrase, or the technical term for it is called the ablative of agent. It's called an ablative of agent because it uses the ablative case noun after the preposition ab, and I have to translate it as by. The agent is simply the doer of the action. So those two words, a Pandora, must be translated as by Pandora after the passive voice verb. To finish that clause, there's one more prepositional phrase, in terras, which will complete the idea stated in the relative clause. Be careful when you translate it, because in is not followed by an ablative case noun, rather an accusative case noun. And that changes the translation of in from in, on, or among to something else. If you're not sure what, make sure to check it out on your vocabulary list. Remember, when you use the relative clause, quae in terras a Pandora mittebantur, you must place it in your English translation immediately after the noun, which is the antecedent of the relative pronoun, or injurias. That's a lot of information. I hope you've got it down. And now I'm going to give you an opportunity to try your hand at writing or translating this sentence into English. Good luck.